The book of Proverbs can give us the impression that it's one of the easiest books in the Bible to read. It's just a bunch of simple phrases that are easy to remember. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. A soft answer turns away wrath. They're simple and compressed, and that makes them easy to carry around with you. But the impression that it's all an easy read starts to run into problems midway through the book, because we start to see that some of the Proverbs contradict each other. The subjects change rapidly. First it's about wealth, then it's about friendship, then it's about controlling your speech, then it's about intimate relationships. And it's hard to see how exactly the book was put together and how the reader is supposed to take it. That comes in part because of the nature of a proverb itself. It's compressed wisdom. It's meant to be small and tight and easy to remember. The brevity is what makes it portable, so that later on you'll be walking around and a certain situation will come up and you'll remember one of these proverbs because they were easy to remember. And you'll suddenly realize, oh, that proverb applies in this particular situation. The compression also creates interpretive work. A proverb rarely explains every circumstance in which its insight might apply. The reader might recognize a certain situation for which it's appropriate when reading it, but not every situation. So the process of interpreting it and applying it is central to the wisdom tradition. The student gradually learns to move from the words of the proverb to the circumstances of life. A scholar named Trimper Longman III has described Proverbs as a book concerned with, quote, the skill of living. That phrase captures something important about the book's purpose. Wisdom involves the capacity to make sound judgments within the circumstances of ordinary life. The wise person must learn how to perceive what is happening before deciding how to respond. A proverb contributes to that process by giving the reader a pattern of understanding. The book of Proverbs, therefore, requires a different kind of reading from a narrative or a sustained theological argument. You can tell immediately when we read this book, we are reading something different than the book of Job. We are reading something different than the book of Psalms. The reader must attend to each individual saying, but also the way the wisdom accumulates through repeated exposure to observations about life. The sayings gradually form a vision of human behavior. Over time, they teach the reader what to notice about life. The Hebrew word usually translated proverb is mashal. Its meaning extends beyond the narrow English category of a traditional saying. The term can refer to a comparison, a poetic statement, a parable, or even a kind of riddle. Proverbs 1:6 speaks of understanding a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The opening of the book therefore presents wisdom as a form of language that requires interpretation. The proverb works through compression. An observation that might require several paragraphs of explanation can be reduced to a single striking image. So for instance, Proverbs 25:16 says, if you have found honey, eat only enough for you, lest you have your fill of it and vomit it. The image is memorable because it makes the danger of excess physically vivid. Honey is desirable. Too much honey becomes sickening. The proverb leaves the reader to recognize how broadly the image may apply. The same technique appears again in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 18. There is one whose rash words are like sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. The saying gives speech a physical effect. A careless sentence is like a weapon, and a wise word is like medicine. The comparison allows the reader, you and I, to perceive something about language that an abstract statement would communicate less powerfully. And that's characteristic of wisdom literature. It seeks to cultivate perception. The reader is taught to see familiar experiences in a new way. A quarrel becomes a conflict that can be intensified or calmed down. A careless word becomes a wound. A repeated habit becomes a path. The images remain open enough to be applied in different settings. Proverbs 25:16 may concern food, but the basic insight concerns the way a good thing can become harmful through excess. Proverbs 12:18 concerns speech, yet the image of a word and the image of healing allow the reader to understand the social consequences of language. The saying, therefore, has a kind of interpretive elasticity. It possesses a definite meaning, but that meaning can become relevant in more than one setting. The reader's circumstances determine the particular form its wisdom will take. This helps explain why the book places such emphasis upon learning. Proverbs 1:5 says that the wise person will hear and increase in learning. Wisdom remains open to further instruction because life continues to present new situations. A person who has learned a proverb has acquired a resource for judgment, but the process of becoming wise continues as that resource is brought into contact with experience. Michael V. Fox's commentary on Proverbs is particularly valuable on this point. He treats the book as a coherent intellectual and moral tradition rather than as a miscellaneous collection of clever observations. The individual sayings contribute to a larger account of human life. Fox's work repeatedly demonstrates how much thought can be contained within a single brief proverb. The saying can occupy a single verse, but its assumptions about human behavior and moral order are substantial. So the brevity of Proverbs should therefore make us more attentive to them rather than less. A short saying can carry a lot of intellectual weight. Hebrew poetry works through relationships between lines. The most important feature of that relationship is called parallelism. A typical proverb contains two poetic lines, and the second line establishes a relationship with the first. Sometimes the second line restates the thought of the first in a new form. Sometimes it sharpens the first line through a contrast. Sometimes it adds a consequence or develops an image. The precise categories used by scholars to describe these relationships have been debated, and the traditional categories should not be treated as rigid formulas. They remain useful because they draw attention to the way lines interact. Look, for instance, at Proverbs chapter 10, verse 12. It says, "Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all offenses." The second line introduces a contrasting force. The proverb is concerned with the consequences of emotional dispositions within a community. Hatred generates further conflict, and love has the capacity to absorb offense rather than multiplying it. The saying is therefore doing more than making two unrelated observations. The two lines create a moral comparison. The reader is invited to contemplate what different dispositions do to relationships. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 18 works a little bit differently. It says, "There is one whose rash words are like sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." The second line develops the first through a contrasting image. The proverb turns language into a physical force. The comparison gives the reader a way of imagining the consequences of speech. This is why the individual lines of a proverb should always be read together. The second line often determines how the first one should be understood. It can narrow the meaning down and deepen it, or supply a perspective through which the first line should then be interpreted. The traditional terminology of synonymous and antithetical parallelism, that's the way these are described. Synonymous and antithetical parallelism. Synonymous meaning the same, having the same meaning, and antithetical meaning having opposite meanings or intentions. And parallelism means they're written to go together. They follow the same structure or vocabulary in some way. So again, it's synonymous parallelism or antithetical parallelism. And that vocabulary is useful, although the category should be regarded as descriptions. Antithetical sayings are especially prominent in the Proverbs because the book repeatedly places wisdom and folly into opposition. Proverbs 10:1 says, "A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother." You see the parallelism there. It's a wise son versus a foolish son, and they play father and mother off of each other, although they're not really meaning a different relationship between the separate gendered parents. They simply mean that a good child and a bad child bear different impacts on their parents. The saying creates a contrast between two forms of characters and then shows those forms of characters affecting the family. The better than sayings add another dimension to the book's method. So Proverbs 16:8 says, "Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues with injustice." The saying asks the reader to make a judgment about value. The comparison places economic success within a larger moral framework. This kind of comparison appears repeatedly in Proverbs. The reader is encouraged to think about what is genuinely desirable. Wealth may be useful, but justice possesses greater value. Honor may be attractive, but integrity determines whether honor is deserved. Pleasure may be enjoyable, but the pursuit of pleasure can become destructive when it is detached from wisdom. The form of the proverb teaches the reader to make these judgments. Again, another scholar, Bruce K. Waltke, has written a commentary and emphasizes the moral purpose of this poetic structure. Proverbs presents the reader with a world in which choices possess consequences and character shapes conduct. The poetic form assists that education because it makes relationships visible. The reader sees one path placed beside another and is then compelled to consider the difference between the two paths. The proverb is kind of a small piece of an argument. Its argument is compressed into poetry. Now, the book of Proverbs is an anthology. The book itself preserves evidence of its history. Proverbs 10:1 introduces the Proverbs of Solomon. Proverbs 25:1 describes another collection of Solomonic sayings, the sayings of King Solomon, that were copied by officials of King Hezekiah. Chapters 30 and 31 introduce the words of Agur and King Lemuel. The final book has therefore brought together material from different collections and traditions. Its structure is not that of a modern essay. The sayings of the Proverbs in chapters 10 through 29, for instance, often stand with considerable independence from one another. That independence has sometimes led readers to assume, as I've described it, that the sayings were placed together without any literary intention. Some scholars argue that it's more complicated than that. The book contains genuine collections, and the individual sayings frequently exist as independent units. At the same time, the final form of the book gives the material a larger setting. So we as readers have to pay attention to all those variables. A proverb possesses its own meaning. Its imagery and syntax have to require careful attention. The surrounding sayings may also influence the way the reader hears it or may not. A cluster of sayings may repeatedly return to a particular concern, cluing us in to the fact that the book was put together in a way that meant for us to pay attention to a sustained subject. One saying may echo an earlier theme. A later collection may offer a different perspective on a question raised earlier in the book. That's why Proverbs is a complicated book to read, despite looking so easy when we first pick it up. The opening chapters provide the clearest example of sustained literary development. Proverbs 1 through 9 contain speeches that return repeatedly to the relationship between wisdom and folly. Wisdom is presented as a voice calling to the public, and then folly also speaks. The young man is placed between competing invitations. The middle collections operate through a different literary rhythm. Their brevity requires the reader to make connections across repeated exposure to similar situations. A saying about speech might stand alone. But after reading dozens of sayings about the destructive power of careless words, the reader begins to perceive a larger concern. The book has trained the reader in the process of reading to notice speech as a central arena of wisdom. This is one of the reasons that Proverbs should be read slowly. A reader who moves rapidly through the book may understand each verse while missing the cumulative effect of the collection. Wisdom develops through repetition. The book returns again and again to certain features of human life. Those repetitions gradually form the reader's moral imagination. The reader begins to recognize that a person's words reveal one's character. A person's response to correction reveals their character. A person's treatment of the poor reveals their character. And so the book's educational strategy depends on an accumulation that makes us realize, oh, we're talking about character here. The most famous example of apparent contradiction in Proverbs occurs in Proverbs chapter 26, verses 4 and 5. And this is what it says. Quote, "Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be a fool yourself. And then answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." The verses stand beside one another. The editor has preserved both sayings, and the result is deliberate, and it means to teach us something. The first verse describes a situation in which responding to foolishness on its own terms makes the wise person turn into a fool. The second verse describes a situation in which foolishness does require an answer because silence would allow the fool to appear wise. The two sayings therefore demand discernment. We have to think about what we're reading, and then we have to choose the appropriate response based on the situation. This pair of verses is one of the clearest demonstrations of the kind of wisdom Proverbs seeks to cultivate in us. It does not assume that every situation is going to follow a specific rule. Rather, you and I have to learn to make judgments given certain circumstances. The same principle goes on throughout the whole book. For instance, again, Proverbs chapter 15 verse 1 says, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." The saying describes a common pattern in human interaction. We've come to discover through our own experience that if we treat people gently, we often get a pleasant response, and if we're harsh, we often get a negative response. The saying is especially useful when we read it as an observation about conversation. It tells us something about what speech tends to do and how the circumstances of a speech, of a given kind of speech matters. Sometimes you have to speak firmly, but a gentle response can be understood. Wisdom lies in recognizing what's appropriate at the current moment. The proverb gives us a principle of perception. It encourages us to notice whether a conversation is moving towards reconciliation or escalation. The same kind of judgment is required by Proverbs chapter 26, verses 4 and 5. The reader has to ask, what kind of fool is in front of me, and what kind of response does this situation requires? The presence of both of these sayings teaches us something about the nature of wisdom itself. Proverbs frequently describes the way life tends to work. The sayings express patterns, and they draw connections between relationship and character and behavior and consequences. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 4 says, "A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes one rich." The proverb observes the relationships between hard work and economic productivity, and that remains true remains true even though economic life contains many additional factors. A person's work ethic matters a lot. If one approaches work in a generally lazy way, it's generally going to result in poverty. Where if one approaches wanting to work hard, one will generally benefit from that. The book itself recognizes this complexity. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 23 says, "The fallow ground of the poor would yield much food, but it is swept away through injustice." So poverty and injustice are connected now, not laziness, but being robbed. The book is capable of holding together the observation that laziness can produce poverty, but also injustice can produce poverty. The wisdom tradition is therefore a little bit more sophisticated than a simple theory about personal responsibility. It recognizes different causes within the same human experience. The same point applies to Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6. "Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it." That saying expresses confidence in parenting and the formation that parents invest in their children. Good habits established in childhood tend to have a powerful influence later in life. The proverb is a statement about formation, but it's not a guarantee that every child will follow parental instruction. The difference matters because the wisdom tradition is concerned with patterns of influence. And it recognizes that human beings, you and I, possess agency and can affect outcomes, but sometimes things are beyond our reach. The sayings about righteousness and prosperity operate in a similar way. Proverbs often associates hard work and wisdom and integrity with flourishing, with benefiting from hard work. But then the book also contains warnings about injustice and oppression, which hard work cannot overcome. This is one of the reasons that Proverbs should be read alongside Job. Proverbs describes the ordinary moral patterns of life. Job confronts the reader with circumstances in which those patterns seem to fail. The two books create a conversation about the limits of human interpretation. Proverbs gives us confidence that human actions matter, and then Job reminds us that consequences cannot be read directly from a person's circumstances. The educational purpose of Proverbs becomes clearer when we consider what happens to a reader who spends a lot of time in the book. The reader encounters repeated situations. A person speaks impulsively and causes harm. A person refuses correction and makes a mistake again. A person pursues immediate pleasure and discovers bad consequences. A person acts with patience and avoids unnecessary conflict. Over time, the reader develops a store of remembered patterns. This is one of the central functions of the wisdom literature. It trains our minds to recognize situations before the situation has developed so that we can make wise choices. A person who has absorbed the wisdom of Proverbs may hear a conversation beginning to move towards anger and recognize where it's going and then be able to intervene. Wisdom causes anticipation. Proverbs 22:3 says, "The prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer from it." The saying describes the difference between two kinds of perception. The prudent person, the wise person, sees what is approaching and acts accordingly. The simple person marches forward without recognizing the danger. So the issue is not one of intelligence. Wisdom is not concerned about how educated we are. The wise person possesses the ability to interpret circumstances. This is why the wisdom tradition places such emphasis upon paying attention. The wise person notices and remembers and learns. Proverbs 14:8 says, "The wisdom of the prudent is to discern his way, but the folly of fools is deceiving." The wise person understands the path being taken, and the fool remains confused. The image of a path is central to Proverbs. Human beings move somewhere through their repeated decisions. A single action can be significant, but it's the repetitions of patterns that determine our ultimate direction. This is one of the book's most important contributions to moral thought. Character is formed through patterns, and repeatedly choosing dishonesty, for instance, will cultivate a bad character. Consistently choosing to learn from one's teacher can develop a good character. The proverb helps the reader recognize the connection between a small decision and a larger pattern. The wisdom tradition rests upon a conviction that the world possesses an intelligible order. This conviction is especially clear in Proverbs chapter 8, where wisdom speaks in connection with the creation of the world. The language is poetic, and scholars disagree about how the personification of wisdom should be understood. But nonetheless, wisdom belongs to the structure of the world that God has made. This conviction explains why Proverbs is concerned with the ordinary details of human behavior. The wisdom teacher observes that certain actions create order versus disorder, and truth allows relationships to function because trust depends on truthful speech. Justice depends on communities doing what is right. Discipline depends on a person seeking meaningful accomplishment through repeated practice of doing good. The wisdom teacher observes these relationships and teaches them to the student. The result is a form of theology grounded in observation. The book's wisdom is concerned with the way the world actually works, and it asks what happens when people behave in certain ways, and then considers the consequences. The wisdom tradition is therefore what we would call empirical. It's like a science experiment. You practice behaving in certain ways in the world, and you get certain results, to the point that the author of Proverbs believed you could develop hypotheses about how behaviors will return certain consequences. The connection with creation explains why the book treats ordinary life as morally significant. The structure of human life belongs to the world that God made, and when we operate in harmony with God's world, we live well. Notice how the three books that we've studied work together now. We've looked at Job and Psalms and Proverbs, and they're very different styles of writing, but they are placed side by side on purpose. They complement each other. Proverbs studies the patterns of human life. Job examines the crisis when those patterns break. And Psalms give us the language to process the experience of life, which can be so confusing. The relationship between Proverbs and Job is especially important because Proverbs says the world has a moral order that produces measurable consequences, and Job shows what happens when those structures fall apart. The wisdom of Proverbs requires the humility of Job. A person may understand a general pattern and still misunderstand a particular situation. Like Job's friends. Job's friends are using the kind of wisdom that we find in Proverbs, but they're applying it in the wrong way. They possess principles, but they lack discernment. This will be important in the life of Jesus because Jesus' primary enemies are the Pharisees, the people who know God's law the best. They know all the moral principles, they know all the proverbs, they know all the wisdom, but they fail to recognize God in the flesh when he stands right in front of them. So though they are the keeper of God's law, they fail to recognize God. They failed to recognize the exception, the way Job tells us there will be. Job shows us that the principles will fall apart at certain points. And Jesus was the falling apart of the principles that the Pharisees had clung to. The book of Job is thus an important warning for those who read Proverbs. Psalms adds another dimension. The wise person experiences all kinds of emotions: happiness, sadness, grief, fear, anger. And Psalms give voices to all of those experiences. Together, these books present wisdom as an activity of the whole person. The mind understands. The character must be formed. The emotions are real and should be brought in front of God. Human beings must learn to live with both order and mystery in the world. The book of Proverbs is a collection of short sayings, but the task of reading it requires a lot of judgment. We can begin with an individual saying and pay attention to the images that it uses, and then look at the relationship between the poetic lines. The surrounding context sometimes illuminates a single verse. We then consider the kind of statement being made. Some proverbs are describing recurring patterns, others are making comparison, others are just being funny. Some are warnings, and some are metaphors. We have to imagine the circumstances in which this proverb does and does not apply. This is where the wisdom of the book becomes practical. The final question concerns formation. What kind of perception is this proverb trying to cultivate? The question leads to the heart of the book. Proverbs is concerned with growing judgment and the ability to discern. The reader learns that timing matters and that wisdom requires flexibility because circumstances are not always the same. The wisdom tradition therefore assumes that life is intelligible and that the patterns can be predictable enough that we can measure our choices and make wise decisions. We can develop our own characters and prepare for the future. But then the tradition also assumes that human judgment remains limited. There are always fools who will make bad decisions, even when they think they are wise. And this is why the Proverbs demand more than memorization. The sayings provide us with a vocabulary for interpreting life that allow us to do things like recognize the danger of pride and recognize that desire can be destructive, and then look for ways to develop good character. The book's greatest achievement lies in the way it turns ordinary experience into an education in wisdom. A conversation becomes an opportunity to observe the power of speech, or a financial decision becomes an occasion to consider the relationship between wealth and integrity. Proverbs teaches us to make these connections. The result is a kind of wisdom that is practical and theological. It sticks with us. We carry it around in our minds. We're forced to think about it and contemplate it, and then in certain situations apply it. Sometimes we'll go back and read the book of Proverbs and realize there was wisdom there we missed that we could have used in our younger years. But because of the nature of the book, it is always calling us forward to be more and more wise and to grow in our wisdom. The ideal situation is that we who spend a lifetime following after Jesus and learning to be wise would one day be able to pass that wisdom on to the next generation the way Solomon and the authors of Proverbs are passing wisdom on to their next generation. You and I, as followers of Jesus, are called in every season to make sure that the next generation receives the faith. And the Proverbs are a great example of how that happens. I hope this helps your understanding of the book of Proverbs. My deep hope is that you will just dive into the book of Proverbs itself and get used to its cadences and vocabulary and learn to love the way it's written. There are, I think, 31 chapters in Proverbs, so you can pick a month of the year and read a chapter a day and be done with it in a month. Anyway, have at it, and I'll see you again in the next lecture.